They call me T-Mac, Timothy McGhee of the Toonerville Rips-13, and for 20 years I wielded power that most gang leaders never even dream of touching. While other shot callers were fighting over street corners and dope houses, I was playing a different game entirely. I controlled politicians, judges, police captains, and yes, even governors of the state of California. Not through violence alone, though I've ordered plenty of that. Not through money alone, though we moved millions. But through something far more valuable in this corrupted system: information. I collected secrets like other men collect guns. I knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. And from my cell in Pelican Bay Supermax, where I've been locked down for the past 15 years serving multiple life sentences, I'm finally ready to tell the truth about how a gangbanger from Northeast Los Angeles built an empire of political corruption that reached the highest levels of California government. I grew up in the Toonerville projects of Northeast LA in the early 1980s, when crack cocaine was flooding the streets and gang warfare was reaching apocalyptic levels. My mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, and my father was doing 25 to life in Folsom for armed robbery. The projects were controlled by Toonerville Rips, one of the oldest Latino gangs in Los Angeles, going back to the 1940s. By the time I was 10 years old, I was running errands for the veteranos, learning the rules of the street. By 12, I was selling dime bags on the corner. By 14, I had my first body, a rival from avenues who had disrespected our neighborhood. The system failed me long before I failed society, but I'm not making excuses. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I chose this path because I saw no other way to survive and prosper in the environment I was born into. What made me different from other young gangsters was my mind. I was smart, strategic, always thinking 3 moves ahead. While other fools were getting high on their own supply and making stupid moves that got them killed or locked up, I stayed disciplined. I read everything I could get my hands on: books about history, politics, psychology, warfare. I studied how real power works in this world, and I understood early that the streets were just the bottom level of a much larger game. The real power was in the institutions, in the government, in the systems that controlled everything. And I realized that those systems were just as corrupt as the streets, maybe more so. They just had better PR and wore nicer suits. That realization changed everything for me. By 1992, when I was 21 years old, I had risen to shot caller status in Toonerville. The Los Angeles riots that year created chaos and opportunity in equal measure. While the city burned and everyone was focused on Rodney King and the LAPD, we were expanding our operations into territories that had been contested for decades. But I was already thinking bigger. I had made connections with a dirty cop in the Foothill Division, a sergeant named Martinez who was taking bribes to look the other way on our drug operations. Well, one night he got drunk and told me something that changed my entire approach to the game. He said that everyone in power, from street cops to city councilmen to state politicians, had dirt. Everyone had secrets they wanted buried. And whoever controlled those secrets controlled the people. I started building files. Every transaction we made with corrupt officials, I documented. Every politician who took money from us, I had photographed. Every cop who looked the other way, I had recorded. Every judge who dismissed cases for us, I kept evidence. I wasn't doing it to snitch. I was doing it to build leverage. Insurance policies that would protect me and my organization. But as my collection of secrets grew, I realized I had stumbled onto something much bigger than protection. I had found the keys to real power. Within 5 years, I had enough dirt on so many people in positions of authority that I could essentially operate with impunity. We weren't just a street gang anymore. We were part of the system itself, connected to the very institutions that were supposed to be fighting us. The first governor I influenced was in the late 90s. I won't name him directly because some of what I'm about to reveal could still blow back on people. And despite everything, I'm not trying to get anyone killed. But this governor had ambitions beyond California, national ambitions. He needed money for his campaigns, lots of it. And he wasn't too careful about where it came from. We set up legitimate-looking businesses, fronts that could donate to his campaign committees without raising red flags. Construction companies, consulting firms, restaurant chains. We pumped hundreds of thousands of dollars into his war chest over several election cycles, and in return we got access. Not direct, obvious corruption, but subtle favors. Pardons for certain inmates. appointments of sympathetic judges, pressure on district attorneys to go easy on certain cases, policies that kept the heat off our operations while focusing law enforcement resources elsewhere. But money alone wasn't enough to control a governor. What really gave us leverage was information. Through our connections in law enforcement, we learned that this governor had a problem. A serious skeleton in his closet involving an affair with a staffer and some financial irregularities in his earlier political careers. We obtained documents, recordings, photographs, nothing illegal in how we got them. We just knew the right people to ask and the right palms to grease. Once we had that information, the relationship changed completely. He wasn't just accepting our support anymore, he was dependent on our silence. And that's when I understood the real mechanism of power in this country. It's not about who has the most guns or even the most money. It's about who controls the flow of information in an age where everyone has something to hide. The second governor was even easier to compromise. He came from a law and order background, had built his political career on being tough on crime and gangs. The irony was almost funny. This man who gave speeches about cracking down on street violence was taking money from us through intermediaries he pretended not to know about. His chief of staff was the connection, an ambitious political operative who understood that campaigns cost money and didn't ask too many questions about where it came from. We laundered our contributions through a network of donors and PACs, so complex that even experienced investigators would have trouble tracing it back to us. And just like with the previous governor, once we had financial connections established, we started collecting the real leverage, compromising information about his personal life, his business dealings before he entered politics, his connections to other questionable figures. What most people don't understand about political corruption is how mundane and bureaucratic it actually is. There are no dramatic meetings in dark alleys, no briefcases full of cash exchanging hands in parking garages. It's all done through legitimate-looking channels. Campaign contributions, consulting contracts, speaking fees, book deals. The system is designed to allow corruption while maintaining plausible deniability. Politicians can take money from terrible people and claim they didn't know the source. They can do favors for donors and call it constituent services. They can appoint cronies and call it meritocracy. The whole thing is an elaborate theater designed to hide the truth from the public while allowing the powerful to enrich themselves and protect their positions. We just tapped into mechanisms that were already there. By 2005, Toonerville Rips was no longer just a street gang. We had evolved into something more sophisticated, a criminal enterprise with tentacles reaching into legitimate business and government. We controlled construction contracts worth tens of millions. We had investments in real estate, restaurants, auto dealerships, waste management companies. We were laundering money through so many legitimate businesses that even we sometimes lost track of where the clean money ended and the dirty money began. And protecting all of this required political connections at every level. City councilmen who would approve our developments, county supervisors who would award us contracts, state legislators who would shape regulations in ways favorable to our interests, and governors who would ensure that law enforcement priorities focused anywhere except on us. The third governor I dealt with was perhaps the most corrupt of all, precisely because he believed he wasn't corrupt. He convinced himself that the money he was taking was just normal political fundraising, that the favors he was doing were just a good governance, that his connections to questionable figures were just networking. He was a master of rationalization, able to justify anything he did by framing it in terms of the greater good. He was helping businesses create jobs. He was being practical about law enforcement priorities. He was building coalitions that required compromises. In his mind, he was a pragmatic leader, navigating a complex system. In reality, he was completely compromised, making decisions based on the interests of his financial backers rather than the public good. And we were among his biggest backers, hidden behind layers of legitimate-looking donors. What I provided these governors wasn't just money and information. I provided them with a network. See, we weren't the only ones playing this game. There were other criminal organizations, other special interests, other powerful people who needed things from government and were willing to pay for it. I became a broker, connecting people who wanted things with politicians who could provide them. A developer who needed zoning changes, a union that wanted favorable labor regulations, a corporation seeking tax breaks, a foreign businessman wanting entree into California markets. I could make those connections happen. And every connection I facilitated gave me more power, more leverage, more secrets to collect. I was building a web of mutual compromising interests where everyone was implicated and therefore everyone had motivation to protect the system. The power I wielded during those years was intoxicating. I was a kid from the projects who had dropped out of high school, but I was influencing policies that affected millions of people. I was sitting in meetings with some of the most powerful people in California, not physically, of course, but through intermediaries. My decisions affected who got appointed to judgeships, which legislation moved forward, how law enforcement resources were allocated, and all the while, I was still running a violent street gang. We were still dealing drugs, still committing robberies, still ordering hits on rivals and snitches. The duality was surreal. I could be planning a political strategy in the morning and ordering someone's execution in the afternoon. It didn't feel contradictory at the time because I saw it all as part of the same game, just operating at different levels. But of course, it couldn't last forever. The higher you climb, the harder you fall, and I climbed very high. My downfall came not from the politicians or the corrupt cops or any of the powerful people I'd compromised. It came from within my own organization. A trusted lieutenant who I had brought up through the ranks decided he wanted more power for himself. He started cooperating with the FBI, wearing a wire, documenting everything. For 2 years, he fed information to federal investigators building a RICO case against me and the entire Toonerville leadership structure. When they finally moved in 2009, they had everything: recordings, documents, testimony from multiple cooperating witnesses. They charged me with racketeering, murder, drug trafficking, conspiracy, everything they could throw at me. The trial lasted 8 months and made headlines across California. What didn't make headlines was how many powerful people were sweating during that trial. How many politicians and officials were terrified that my lawyers would introduce evidence about their connections to us. How many backroom conversations happened about damage control and limiting exposure. The prosecutors were very careful about what evidence they introduced, focusing on the street-level crimes while avoiding the political corruption angle. Not because they didn't know about it, but because opening that box would have implicated too many important people. It would have exposed how deeply compromised the system really was. So they gave me multiple life sentences for the murders and the racketeering, and all the political stuff stayed buried. The public got to see a dangerous gang leader put away for life, and the system protected itself from the truth about its own corruption. I've been in Pelican Bay for 15 years now, 23 hours a day in a concrete box, no human contact except through barriers and bars. The SHU, the security housing unit, where they put the most dangerous inmates. It's designed to break you mentally, to destroy your soul through isolation. Some men go crazy here, talking to themselves, screaming at walls. Others find religion, spending their days in prayer. I spend my time thinking about everything that happened, about the empire I built and lost, about all the violence I ordered and participated in, about the corruption I facilitated at the highest levels. And I've decided that the truth needs to come out. Not for redemption, I'm beyond that. Not for revenge, though there are plenty of people who deserve to be exposed, but because the public deserves to know how their government really works, how easily their leaders can be compromised and controlled by criminal organizations. The story I'm about to tell won't make me look good. I'm not the hero of this narrative. I'm a murderer, a drug dealer, a corrupter of public officials. I've done terrible things, and I'll die in this prison, deservedly so. But I'm also someone who saw how the system really operates at its highest levels, who participated in corrupting that system, who knows where all the bodies are buried. And before I die in this concrete tomb, I want the truth documented. I want people to understand that the gang violence in the streets and the corruption in the halls of power aren't separate problems. They're connected, part of the same broken system where money and violence flow up and down the hierarchy, where the powerful exploit the desperate and everyone pretends not to see the obvious truth. This is my confession, my testimony, my final statement, the story of how a gangbanger from Toonerville controlled governors of California. Growing up in Northeast LA in the 80s was like growing up in a war zone. Gunshots every night, police helicopters circling overhead, memorial candles on every corner for homies who didn't make it to their 20th birthday. The projects where I lived were controlled territory, and every resident paid tribute one way or another. My mother tried to keep me away from the gang life, but it was impossible. The gang wasn't just a criminal organization, it was the social structure of the neighborhood. It provided protection, identity, economic opportunity, family. My real father was gone, locked up when I was 5. The veteranos of Toonerville became my father figures, teaching me how to survive in this environment. By the time I was in middle school, I knew more about criminal enterprise than I did about algebra or history. School was irrelevant, a place where I went to recruit younger kids and establish dominance. The real education happened on the streets. My first serious crime was an armed robbery when I was 13. 3 of us held up a liquor store on Figueroa Street, got away with $300 and some cigarettes. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The rush of adrenaline, the power of holding a gun and making people afraid, the feeling of taking what I wanted instead of begging for scraps. That robbery changed something in me. I realized I didn't have to accept the poverty and powerlessness I was born into. I could take what I wanted through force and intelligence. The older homies who had sent us on that robbery were impressed with how I handled it, how I stayed calm under pressure, how I made sure we didn't leave evidence. They started giving me more responsibility, more serious assignments. By 15, I was running my own crew of younger kids, organizing burglaries and drug sales in our territory. The first time I killed someone, I was 14 years old. It was a gang war situation, retaliation for a drive-by that had killed one of our members. We caught a guy from Avenues walking alone near the park. 3 of us surrounded him, and I was the one who pulled the trigger. 4 shots, center mass. He dropped like his strings had been cut. We ran to a car, waiting 2 blocks away, and were gone before anyone could react. I expected to feel something, guilt or horror or triumph, but I felt nothing. Just an empty coldness, like I had turned off a switch inside myself. The older homies celebrated me that night, calling me a soldier, a true rider. I had proven myself worthy of respect. Looking back now, I understand what really happened. I had murdered my own humanity along with that kid. I had crossed a line that fundamentally changed who I was as a person, and I did it before I was old enough to fully comprehend what I was throwing away. The crack epidemic of the mid-'80s transformed gang economics completely. Suddenly, there was real money to be made, serious money that dwarfed what we were getting from robberies and marijuana sales. The Colombians were flooding cocaine into Los Angeles through connections with Mexican cartels, and street gangs like ours became the distribution network. We were making thousands of dollars a day, more money than most people in our neighborhood would see in a year of legitimate work. And with that money came escalating violence. Every gang in LA wanted a piece of the crack trade, and territorial disputes that had once been settled with fists and occasional gunfire became all-out wars with automatic weapons and drive-bys that killed innocent bystanders. The LAPD was overwhelmed, understaffed, and outgunned. We owned the streets during those years, and the authorities seemed powerless to stop us. I was 17 when I met Martinez, the corrupt cop who would inadvertently teach me about real power. He had stopped me for a broken taillight, found drugs and a gun in my car, and instead of arresting me, he offered a deal. $500 and he would forget what he found. I paid him, not because I had to, but because I recognized an opportunity. Over the next few months, I cultivated a relationship with him, paying him regularly to tip us off about police operations and to protect our drug houses. He was nervous at first, paranoid about getting caught, but the money was too good and he needed it badly. Gambling debts, child support, a lifestyle he couldn't maintain on a police salary. His corruption wasn't ideological, it was practical desperation. And that made him perfect for my purposes. One night when Martinez was drunk and feeling philosophical, he told me something that fundamentally changed my worldview. He said that everyone in the system was dirty. That corruption went all the way to the top. That the only difference between street criminals like me and respectable society was presentation. He said cops, judges, politicians, business leaders, they all had dirt. They all cut corners and broke rules. They just did it in ways that were socially acceptable, or at least deniable. He said the entire system was built on hypocrisy and hidden corruption, and the only people who got punished were the ones stupid enough or unlucky enough to get caught in obvious ways. That conversation planted a seed in my mind. If everyone in power was corrupt, if the system itself was fundamentally compromised, then why should I play by rules that no one else followed? Why not embrace the corruption and use it to my advantage? I started thinking strategically about how to build real power, not just street-level gang power, but institutional power. I studied how the mafia had done it, how they infiltrated unions and legitimate businesses and political machines. I read about political corruption scandals and what made people vulnerable to blackmail and coercion. I began to understand that the key was creating relationships of mutual compromise, where both parties had something to lose if the truth came out. It wasn't enough to just bribe someone. You had to create a situation where they were complicit, where they had skin in the game and couldn't back out without destroying themselves. That required patience, documentation, and strategic thinking beyond what most criminals ever develop. But I had the intelligence and discipline to execute that kind of long-term strategy. By 1993, I was the youngest shot caller in Toonerville history, controlling multiple drug operations and a crew of over 50 active members. But I was also starting to build my political operation. I had several cops on the payroll, a clerk in the district attorney's office, a bail bondsman who helped us move information, and a lawyer who specialized in defending gang members and knew how to work the system. I wasn't just running a gang anymore. I was building an intelligence network that could gather and exploit secrets. Every transaction, every conversation, every dealing with officials, I documented. I bought hidden cameras and recording devices, technology that was becoming more accessible and affordable. I created files on everyone we dealt with, every corrupt official, every compromised authority figure. I kept multiple copies in different secure locations. This information was my insurance policy, my leverage, my power. The 1994 crime bill and three strikes law in California changed the game significantly. Suddenly, the penalties for gang activities escalated dramatically, and the prisons started filling with gang members serving enhanced sentences. Many gang leaders got swept up in aggressive prosecutions under new racketeering statutes. I watched contemporaries who I'd come up with get sentenced to life in prison for crimes that would have gotten them 5 or 10 years just a few years earlier. The system was cracking down hard, and I knew I needed to adapt or I would end up like them. That's when I really accelerated my political corruption strategy. The best way to avoid prosecution wasn't to stop committing crimes. It was to compromise the people doing the prosecuting and judging. If I could control who became district attorney, who got appointed to the bench, how law enforcement resources were allocated, I could create a protected space for my operations. The first major political contribution we made was to a city council candidate in 1995. We laundered $30,000 through various donors and businesses we controlled, making it look like legitimate support from local business owners and concerned citizens. The candidate won by a narrow margin, and our money probably made the difference. Suddenly, we had someone on the city council who owed us. Nothing overt or obvious, but when zoning issues came up that affected our interests, he was sympathetic. When the police chief needed council approval for budget requests, he would ask questions about whether resources were being allocated properly or if maybe they were wasting time on minor offenses instead of serious crimes. Little interventions that gave us breathing room to operate. And more importantly, this gave us a template for how to scale up the operation. Over the next few years, we expanded our political influence systematically. Local school board members, county supervisors, state assembly candidates, judges running for election or seeking appointments. We identified who needed money, who was vulnerable to financial pressure, who had expensive habits or debts or ambitions beyond their means. California politics is expensive, and there is never enough money in campaign coffers. Candidates who might be perfectly honest in their intentions find themselves making compromises just to stay competitive. We offered them the resources they needed, and in return, we gained influence and access. Not control in any obvious sense, not enough to make them do things they would never otherwise do, but enough to tilt decisions in our favor when it mattered, enough to ensure that we weren't priorities for law enforcement, enough to keep the system from focusing too hard on our operations. It was a gradual process, building a web of obligation and compromise one relationship at a time. My first indirect contact with a gubernatorial campaign came in 1997. A political consultant I knew was working for a candidate who was considered a serious contender in the upcoming election. This consultant understood where money came from in California politics, understood that not all donations come from civic-minded citizens and clean corporations. He approached me through intermediaries, very carefully, never saying anything explicitly incriminating, but making it clear that his candidate needed financial support and wasn't going to ask too many questions about sources. We structured a series of contributions through front businesses and straw donors, totaling over $200,000 spread across the primary and general election campaigns. The candidate won, becoming California's governor, and suddenly I had a connection to the highest level of state government. Not direct access, nothing that obvious, but a channel through which communication could flow and interests could be represented. And the relationship with that first governor was mostly transactional at the start. We provided ongoing financial support through various channels, and in return we got consideration for our interests. Not dramatic favors or obvious corruption, but subtle helps. When someone we wanted got nominated for a judgeship, the governor's office would expedite the appointment process. When there were investigations into businesses we controlled, those investigations would somehow lose priority and resources. When sentencing reform was being debated, the governor would shape his positions in ways that didn't directly impact our operations. It was all carefully calibrated to avoid anything that would trigger obvious red flags. The genius of systemic corruption is that it operates through thousands of small decisions that individually seem reasonable, but collectively amount to a compromised system. But what really gave us leverage over that governor wasn't the money or the ongoing support. It was what we learned about him through our intelligence network. One of our people in law enforcement obtained information about an affair the governor had conducted years earlier before his political career took off, with a woman who had later received a suspiciously large contract with a company he had connections to. Nothing technically illegal, but politically explosive if it came out. We also had documents showing some questionable financial dealings in his earlier business career, tax issues that had been quietly settled, but would look terrible under public scrutiny. We didn't threaten him with this information directly. That would be too crude and risky. But we made sure he knew through intermediaries that we possessed it and that we had no interest in seeing it become public as long as our relationship remained productive. That changed the dynamic completely. He wasn't just accepting our support anymore. He was dependent on our discretion. The mechanics of how we delivered this message were carefully planned. A lawyer representing our interests arranged a meeting with the governor's chief of staff, ostensibly to discuss some routine matter of constituent services. During that meeting, the lawyer mentioned in passing that in the course of our various business activities, we sometimes came across sensitive information that we felt obligated to protect and keep confidential, and that discretion and loyalty were values we took very seriously. He referenced the affair and the financial issues just obliquely enough that the message was clear without being an explicit threat. The chief of staff understood immediately. A few weeks later, through the same back channel, we received confirmation that our concerns and interests would continue to be given appropriate consideration. From that point forward, the relationship was fundamentally different. We had moved from being supporters to being essential partners whose silence was required for the governor's political survival. What amazed me during those years was how easy it was to accumulate this kind of leverage. Politicians, like most people in positions of power, have secrets. Affairs, financial improprieties, substance abuse problems, family scandals, ethical violations. They're human beings with flaws and weaknesses, but they operate in an environment where those flaws can end their careers if exposed. And in trying to hide their secrets, they often make connections with people who can help them keep things quiet, which creates new vulnerabilities and dependencies. It's a spiral of compromise that's difficult to escape once you're caught in it. And we weren't the only ones exploiting this dynamic. Special interests of all kinds were playing the same game, accumulating leverage and trading influence. We were just more explicit about being criminals while doing it. The second governor I influenced came to power in 2003 after a recall election that was part political earthquake and part media circus. He was a celebrity, not a traditional politician, and he positioned himself as an outsider who would clean up Sacramento and break the influence of special interests. The irony of what came next would be funny if it wasn't so depressing. His campaign needed money desperately, especially in the later stages when the recall became competitive. Traditional Republican donors were skeptical of his celebrity background and moderate positions on social issues. We saw an opportunity and moved aggressively to fill the funding gap. Through a network of intermediaries and front organizations, we pumped massive amounts of money into supportive, independent expenditure committees, and eventually into his transition team activities. By the time he took office, we had established multiple points of contact with his administration through people we had helped fund into positions. This governor was more complicated than the previous one because he genuinely seemed to believe in what he was doing. He thought he was fighting corruption and special interest influence, even as he was benefiting from exactly that. His chief of staff was the key connection for us, a political operative who understood how money worked in politics and was pragmatic about sources. We never had direct meetings with the governor himself. Everything went through this chief of staff who controlled access and information flow. The chief of staff was smart enough to keep things deniable, structuring our relationship so the governor could honestly claim ignorance about who was really behind some of his support. This gave everyone plausible deniability while allowing us to get what we needed: appointments of sympathetic judges and favorable positions on criminal justice reform, allocation of law enforcement resources toward other priorities. What we had on this governor wasn't personal scandal, but financial entanglement. Before entering politics, he had business dealings that were complex and involved partnerships with some questionable people. Nothing overtly criminal, but relationships and transactions that would look bad under intense scrutiny and would contradict his outsider image. We had documents detailing some of these relationships, obtained through connections in the business world and through some targeted investigation on our part. We also knew about ongoing financial arrangements between his businesses and entities that had regulatory issues with the state. Again, nothing technically illegal, but politically problematic, and this information was our insurance that the relationship would remain productive. As long as things worked smoothly, there was no reason for any of this to come to light. But if the administration decided to crack down on our operations specifically, well, that would be unfortunate for everyone involved. The level of access and influence I had during those years was extraordinary. I was a gang leader running criminal operations across Los Angeles and beyond, but I was also effectively a political power broker. I had influence over judicial appointments, law enforcement priorities, legislative initiatives, budget allocations. I could make phone calls that would get meetings with high-level officials. I could provide information that would shape policy discussions. I could connect people who wanted things from government with people who could deliver those things. And all of this was happening while I was still actively involved in violence and drug trafficking. I was living two lives simultaneously, one as a street criminal and one as a behind-the-scenes political operator. Looking back, the cognitive dissonance is staggering, but at the time it all seemed like different aspects of the same game. The third governor was perhaps the most naturally corrupt of all, though he would never admit it even to himself. He came from a political family, had spent his entire adult life in public service, and had mastered the art of legalistic corruption that stays technically within the rules while violating their spirit completely. He understood exactly how to take money and do favors without crossing lines that would trigger prosecutions. His campaign finance operation was sophisticated, using every loophole in California's complex election laws to maximize fundraising while maintaining deniability about sources. We loved working with his people because they were professionals who understood how the game was played. No awkward morality, no hand-wringing about propriety, just cold, pragmatic calculation about interests and transactions. Our relationship with this governor's administration was the most extensive of all. We had people connected to multiple departments and agencies, not just through financial contributions, but through years of building relationships and doing favors. When the governor needed support for a controversial policy initiative, we could help deliver it through our networks. When his allies needed financial backing for their own campaigns, we could facilitate that. When there were problems that needed fixing quietly, we had the resources and connections to make things happen. In return, we operated with remarkable freedom. Major law enforcement initiatives would be run past our people for feedback before they were announced. Appointments to key positions would be cleared with us to ensure they were acceptable. Investigations into our operations would mysteriously lose momentum and funding. It was systemic corruption operating at the highest levels of California government. What made this governor particularly valuable was his national ambitions. He saw the governorship as a stepping stone to higher office, possibly the presidency, and That meant he needed to maintain a spotless public image while simultaneously raising massive amounts of money for future campaigns. He needed people who could provide resources without creating exposure. We were perfect for that role, offering financial support through carefully structured channels while also providing intelligence about his political rivals and threats. Information is currency in politics, and we had vast networks gathering information across California. We could tell him things about opponents, rivals, critics, media figures who might cause problems. That intelligence was often as valuable as the money we provided, and it created a dependency that went beyond simple financial corruption. The files I built on these governors and hundreds of other officials were comprehensive and meticulously organized. Every contribution was documented with source information showing how the money really flowed. Every favor was recorded with dates and details. Every piece of compromising information was filed with supporting evidence. I kept multiple copies in different locations, including materials stored with lawyers under attorney-client privilege, in safety deposit boxes in banks under false names, and with trusted associates who would release the information if anything happened to me. This wasn't paranoia, it was insurance. The more powerful my political connections became, the more dangerous I became to those people. They needed me silent, and the files ensured that my silence came with ongoing benefits rather than with a contract hit that would eliminate a problem permanently. By 2007, at the age of 36, I controlled a criminal empire that spanned drugs, weapons, extortion, robbery, fraud, and political corruption. Toonerville had evolved far beyond a traditional street gang into a sophisticated criminal enterprise with legitimate business fronts, political connections, and international reach. We were partnered with Mexican cartels for drug supply, with Armenian organized crime for fraud operations, with corrupt officials at every level of government. Our annual revenue was in the tens of millions, maybe higher, and it was hard to track because so much was laundered through legitimate businesses. I owned properties, luxury vehicles, had offshore accounts, controlled corporations, and I was untouchable because too many powerful people needed me to stay untouchable. My prosecution would lead to their exposure. My cooperation with authorities would bring down a network that implicated hundreds of people across California's political and law enforcement establishment. But power creates enemies, and the higher you rise, the more people want to bring you down. Within my own organization, there were ambitious younger members who wanted my position. Outside, there were rival gangs who hated our success and dominance. And in law enforcement, there were some honest investigators who refused to be compromised and were building cases despite the political pressure to leave us alone. I knew it couldn't last forever. I knew that eventually something would break. But I believed I had enough insurance, enough leverage, enough political protection to survive whatever came. I was wrong. When the end came, it came from a direction I didn't fully anticipate and couldn't control. My downfall began in 2007 when one of my most trusted lieutenants, a guy I had brought up from nothing and treated like a brother, decided to flip. His name was Carlos, and he had been with Toonerville since I was a kid. But the FBI got to him after arresting him on federal gun charges that would put him away for a decade. They offered him a deal: cooperate fully, wear a wire, help build a RICO case against the entire organization, and he would get witness protection and a fresh start for his family. Carlos had young kids, and the thought of missing their entire childhood broke him. He agreed to cooperate, and for 2 years he documented everything while wearing recording devices and building evidence. He was present at meetings where we planned crimes, discussed bribes, talked about political connections. He recorded dozens of hours of conversations that would be devastating in court. The FBI operation was called Street Sweeper, and it was the most extensive investigation of gang activity in Los Angeles history. They were building cases not just against me, but against 50 other Toonerville members, targeting the entire leadership structure. What I didn't know until much later was how carefully they were limiting the scope of the investigation. They were collecting evidence about our street crimes, our drug operations, our violence. But they were being very selective about evidence related to political corruption. When Carlos's recordings touched on our connections to officials, those portions were often excluded from the case files. When documents that showed political contributions and relationships were seized, they somehow didn't make it into evidence. The prosecutors and FBI leadership were making calculated decisions about what they wanted to expose and what they wanted to keep buried. The arrest came down in May 2009, a coordinated sweep across Los Angeles involving hundreds of law enforcement officers. They hit 30 locations simultaneously, taking down gang members, seizing assets, executing search warrants. I was arrested at a girlfriend's apartment at 5 in the morning.